welcome to In Search of Black Power. I'm your host, Lawrence Grandpre. A bit of housekeeping at the top before we get into the episode. So this is a continuation of our previous topic. In general, it is a review of the ideas sparked within me, really, reading Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps Score. Again, the idea is not to be a book review, because the idea is you don't have to have read the book, but I'm also trying to do more work to make the episodes potentially stand alone, because this topic is going to be one that I think is going to appeal even to people that have not heard of the book, have likely heard of one of the main topics of this episode, adverse childhood experiences, or the ACEs test. So because of that, the idea is that there might be some people who didn't listen to part one, and in general, I'm trying to make the episodes not dependent upon people having had listened to the previous episode when I do a multi-part quote-unquote review. So I'm going to do a bit of introduction to some of the things we talked about that allowed me to get to some of the content we didn't get to last time, and then we'll get into it. The idea I'm realizing now with this audio series is very much reminiscent of things we did in the world of debate. So episode 1 is usually how the topic links up with previous lines of thought and political actions that we're working on. Episode 2 in these series are likely going to be what I call the implications or impacts, because even as we point out some of the limitations in these series, there's an unspoken or sometimes spoken argument, which is, well, can't we just work with it? Why they gotta be all that? Does it have to be, everything gotta be so black, you know? And the idea is to really paint in stark contrast to people who are working with these issues, who are dealing with people in that community that are pushing these frameworks onto them, giving them ammunition to explain to them why the stakes are so great when we talk about looking beyond trauma-informed care, looking beyond adverse childhood experiences. So again, given a content warning, given a quote-unquote trigger warning that this episode will talk about traumatic incidences, it will be particularly talking about how these theories, when applied to our people, can lead to traumatic policies and traumatic negative outcomes, with the idea is that there are people dealing with teachers and nonprofits using these frameworks with their nieces, with their children, with people in their community, selling them that these are liberatory approaches, selling them that they should read this book. And people maybe have a feeling that something is missing, and people have a feeling they don't like where it's going, but we're going to tell you in the worst case scenario where this stuff goes, and unfortunately it's not a very good place. But that's part of the value we hope to bring to you all, is that we do the research and we explore, play out the string, if you will, play out the scenario. If we take these ideas to their logical conclusion, where do you end up? I believe you do end up potentially with trauma-informed incarceration. And that's something we're going to talk about today. And this is the work we're doing politically in Baltimore to fight this, comes from these theories. So these are not ideas to exist in the ether or win an internet debate. These are ideas stewed in grassroots political policy, activism, and organizing. If you want to support that, visit lbsbaltimore.com. Of course, support our friends at Black Liberation Media. Check out the new website that just went up. That'll give you links to our episodes and episodes for lots of other shows on the channel. You can give the recurring monthly donation on Patreon, or you can give a one-time donation to help support the channel. Same thing with LBS Baltimore. So with that, we're going to get to the recap, we're going to get to the supercut, and we're going to get to explaining the implications of trauma-informed care, the body keeps score, and adverse childhood experiences. So with that, I'll see you on the other side. In the previous episode, we realized recognition is not liberation, and what one person calls pragmatism stems from their culture and what they believe is possible. And when the oppressor has the ability to define the nature of what trauma looks like for the oppressed, that determines their scope of political possibility and the context of what health and solutions look like. So in the previous episode, we talked about Eurocentric individualism, the idea of locating trauma in the individual being important from a clinical context, of individual clinicians not dismissing individual people's, especially peoples of color's trauma, and physically or psychologically re-traumatizing them. But it has turned into an epistemic political framework from which people are developing curriculum, from which people are developing political theories, from which the larger liberal, nonprofit, public health industrial complex is claiming to operationalize and move billions of dollars of resources for our community, under the theory that, well, if we say that black folk are traumatized and we are helping their trauma by giving them services, that trades off with locking them up. And while that may appear to be a pragmatic concession and the progress in the first view, a deeper analysis of the cultural framework of the trauma views it as deeply individualized, locking it away from larger systemic and political issues, and also replicating Eurocentric notions of technological and scientific ways of thinking that lock us into frameworks that fundamentally push against the incorporation and prioritization of communalist African-centered culture. One of the things that I think was so jarring, because it's so rapacious in all these circles, is the critique of brain scans that we presented in the last episode. And again, Posner's book, McMindfulness, his critique of brain scans use in mindfulness, was used to show that even though they look so beautiful and so scientific, they appear so intuitively persuasive because of how the Eurocentric technological culture views the brain as the seat of all personhood and all cognition. And in reality, these brain scans are not the objective scientific analysis that they're being sold to us as. When in reality, these glowing brain scans only represent a small distinction in blood flows between one part of the brain to the other, and do not show the totality of a human being. Where's love in the brain? Where's community in the brain? Where's culture in the brain? But beyond that, when you combine the cultural analysis, the political analysis, and the critique of brain scans, you start to see the ways in which these theories can really be deployed to pathologize our community. And if we go back to the example Van der Kolk uses of the Vietnam War and think about it through the lens of brain scans, you have two soldiers. Both have PTSD on the brain scan. They show the exact same glowing regions of the brain that show traumatic sense of loss. For one soldier, it could be the sense of loss of a beloved captain fighting the evil Viet Cong, the communist hordes coming to destroy his beloved white America. For another soldier, a black soldier, it could be the loss of a fellow black soldier drafted into an unjust war, forced to fight for a country that was not giving him his civil rights. They would look exactly the same on those brain scans. And that's the danger that comes with grafting ourselves onto these notions of objective scientific progress, because they really risk potentially pathologizing, which in that case would be legitimate political dissent. And of course, he gives the example of the soldier not wanting to take his meds because he would lose his dreams, in which he remembers his dead colleagues. And from an African-centered cultural context, that is for many practitioners of African cultural theories of wellness, that can be seen as a connection to an ancestors or divine spirits to be worked with. On the contrary, Bessel van der Kolk, the author of the book The Body Keeps Score, saw that as a primary example of unhealth that needed to be addressed through an understanding of trauma, as opposed to pieces of a cultural relationship to pain and loss that could be seen as having the seeds of something to work with that could be developed and expanded upon, as many practitioners from an African-centered cultural perspective would perceive that. Another quick example, because I think these are so demonstrative of why we have to challenge what seem like unproblematic uses of things like neuroscience and brain scans. Let's say you have a white GI who comes home and he's angry. He's like Rambo in the first Rambo movie, and he sees his country betraying him, calling him a baby killer. And that's the context of his trauma, seeing his union be undermined by what he sees as racial integration. These are all lamentations that could be seen objectively on that brain scan as trauma. And his political redress for that trauma might be doing something like voting for Reagan. Obviously, this will look very different from a political perspective. Thinking about the black GIs coming home, not just the deindustrializations, but COINTELPRO. What type of brain scans are they showing? They're probably showing things like paranoia on that brain scan because they think the government's out to get them. But guess what? In many cases it was. As opposed to thinking about these complex issues and how they manifest themselves, in our psyches we are relying on academic Eurocentric public health interpretations of our mental states, pathologizing them, and turning them into political capital. But one of the biggest things that I think we have to interrogate here is the ways in which these theories are being applied to young people, to children. And even those who I think can hear the criticism say, but these are babies we're talking about. If we can show people the impacts of trauma on our children, certainly they have to invest in them, even if they don't care about me as an adult. The politically sympathetic child presenting their trauma can connect to people as parents and mothers. And if we see the long-term impacts of trauma on children, the fact that we save so much money as a society if we address trauma early, then we can really make this trauma-informed care stuff worth it. So here is our second supercut of the author of The Body Keeps Score, Bessel van der Kolk, talking about the long-term impacts of childhood trauma and some of the things he views as a solution. And then we'll come back and restart our analysis.
In the culture I live in is 9/11, the attack on the World Trade Center. When there's an overt trauma, people tend to be very generous in terms of coming to people's help. But these private traumas of abuse, etc., become hidden, and people try to go on with their lives, but they keep reacting as if it's still going on.
What we have learned over the past 20 years or so is that early childhood adverse experiences, meaning abuse, neglect, having very inconsistent parents, parents who yell at you, scream at you, hit you, who have domestic violence, having these experiences leaves children with a central nervous system and with bodies that get stuck in being worried about getting hit, getting hurt, and their brain gets sort of rewired to experience the world as a very dangerous place. When children are exposed to these very adverse conditions and cannot feel safe with their parents or in their school systems or somewhere else, then their bodies get wired to be prepared to be hit, to be neglected, to be abandoned, etc., etc. And these become long-term biological effects that have an effect on how their immune system works, how their attention and concentration works. What is very clear is that the single most helpful intervention we can give to people is to help young parents take care of their children, to get babysitting, to get ways of calming themselves down, because if the parents are able to regulate their own arousal system and their own capacity for mutuality, of being there for each other and tolerating each other, then the kids benefit and the kids become calmer also. Just talking about what's happening may be important, but what's equally important is to really be there and to do what we are meant to do as creatures, namely to be in sync with each other. You sing together, you move together. And one of the best predictors of long-term mental and physical health is kids who engage in sports activities with other kids, learning how to pass a basketball to each other, learning how to play team sports where you work together on making things happen that give you a sense of pleasure of being in sync with other human beings, and a sense of predictability, that there are clear rules to the game, that if you do that, it has certain consequences. And what we know is that the brain is basically a predictive organ. The way that the brain is formed is it allows you to predict what will happen next. And so the brain gets formed on the basis of experiences. So If you grow up in a loving, predictable, well-organized household, you get a sense of continuity and a sense of what will happen next. If you grow up in an environment that's unpredictable, where people are drunk from time to time and involved in drugs and dramatic suicide attempts and things like that, you are always worried that something else is going to happen, and your brain becomes an organ that very much tells you, let's see where the danger is, see how I'm going to get hurt. And our job as professionals is to reform that brain to help kids to become calm and safe. So what are some of the other things that we can do? We can do yoga with kids together. We can make music together. Anything you can do together with other people gives you a sense of pleasure and belonging. And pleasure and belonging is the opposite of trauma.
At the core of much trauma is people being unable to do something to change the situation. And so people go into a state where their agency no longer matters. As long as you can move in response to a really challenging situation and do something, you're going to be all right. And at the core of what makes something traumatic is oftentimes an inability to do anything. And many traumatized people tend to become very passive and tend to sort of ask us for pills and stuff to make their feelings go away, but it becomes very hard for them to do things and to activate their bodies. And so movement and doing something that makes your body feel alive and capable is a very important part of being alive.
Of course, many of you out there will be familiar with the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences. While we're going to talk about the specifics, I didn't want to lead with that because just telling you how it functions doesn't explain why it's become such a phenomenon. And Bessel van der Kolk's analysis is important because not only is the analysis so intuitively persuasive, because many of us can think of how childhood traumas have impacted our lives, his solutions are things that would seem to be politically impossible not to support. Giving money to young parents, having them help with childcare, but also play. It's deeply emotionally persuasive. Giving young people the space to play could be the solution to so many social ills because, as many of you know, the argument that the ACEs study advocates claim is that if you use this test to evaluate if young people have been subject to certain traumatic experiences, you can predict things like addiction rates. You can predict things like obesity. You can predict a bevy of expensive and very painful future ailments just by seeing the levels of trauma that young people face. However, and this is one of the many quotes that I've had to cut just for the sake of time, if you actually look at what van der Kolk writes about the ACEs study, something I didn't know. The ACEs study was not done by a social justice organization. It was not done by radical academics. It was not done by anybody from a grassroots perspective. It was funded by health insurance companies. And the goal was to be able to predict future illness because these insurance companies were paying so much money treating these illnesses when they turned into diabetes and obesity that they wanted to be able to predict ways to understand what their liability would be in the future. And of course, it's taken on this massive social justice emotional appeal, but the intent was to control healthcare spending costs by predicting future illness via childhood experiences. So given that, let's actually look at the criteria that the original ACEs test applied, because this will set us up for those who begin to question and critique the way ACEs is being deployed. So if you look at the criteria, originally there are 8. Did you experience physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse? Did you witness alcoholism or drug abuse? So that's 4. Mental illness of a household member, 5. 6, incarceration of household members. 7, witnessing domestic abuse. 8, divorce or separation of parents. these are all tied to the household. And it's not an accident that these are the criteria that are focused on, because the majority of people in this study, think about the people who you know who have good insurance. Many of them are folks whose families aren't employed. Many of them, in this case, the majority of which were white. And so by focusing so much on the household, because that was what was traumatic for these families, that they saw big deltas, big variances between relatively stable white households that had insurance, when you had the negative outcomes of addiction and obesity, for them it was correlated to trauma. Specifically household trauma, family trauma. But even if you look at those criteria, you can see that many of them can be seen as proxies for race. The most obvious one is incarceration of a household member. But if you also just think about all the collateral consequences of racialized hyper-incarceration, things like the substance abuse that happens in jail or drives people to be incarcerated, things like the impact on families of divorce, of family separation because of incarceration, you can see that not having a framework to interpret race and oppression is going to inherently make black ACE scores a lot higher, and then you're blaming disparate health outcomes for black and brown people on their ACEs and their trauma, not the systems of violence that produce that trauma. So I'm going to read for you a section of an academic paper. It was written by Addison, and please excuse me for the mispronunciation, Duania and Alex Winginghoff. The Road Ahead, Moving Beyond ACEs and Transformation of SEL. SEL is Social Emotional Learning. Not only does this quote address many of the substantive criticisms of ACEs, but it captures one of the reasons why I wanted to include the supercut. It captures why ACEs has become such an intuitive and emotional and popular framework for understanding what's wrong with our young people. How it fits so neatly into our desire to check a box and have a score and just be this objective metric that we can then wave in front of all the people that dismissed our trauma and dismissed our demands for more investment in our young people. And how that sense of political desperation, because that's what that is then not applied to we need a different politics. It is applied to what is the tool that can fit within the existing political and really professional order that many of us are situated in. Because if you're a teacher or working within a nonprofit institution, given the systems of quantitative fetishism many of those institutions have, that the metrics that the funders and decision makers are looking for, this is something that fits so neatly into that framework. It has been exploding in popularity. So it's important for us not just to understand the limitations, but also understand why the framework has become so politically intuitive and persuasive to so many people, and to really hammer home, as we will continue in this episode to do, what are the dangers and the potential negative implications for latching us to this concept of adverse childhood experiences. So I'm going to read for you a somewhat lengthy segment of this paper, because I do think having it all in one place, a one-stop shop, a clear quote for you to be able to pull from, to be able to look back to understand why people have been willing to say, as these authors do, that they have gotten to the point where they believe that ACEs cannot be used in a liberatory way, and that we have to go beyond ACEs to accomplish transformative socio-emotional learning from their perspective. But I think from our perspective, we're going to focus on Black community self-determination and holistic wellness from that perspective for our young people. So here's the quote. I was a first-year teacher. The school psychologist asked me if I'd heard about the ACEs study. I hadn't, so he pulled it up on her computer. I looked at the infographic, and like so many who encountered that visual, everything suddenly, quote, made sense. You see, when you've been looking and hoping for an answer for so long, the moment you encounter ACEs, you think, Eureka, there it is. Because if you found an answer, it assumes that you can also find a solution. I also realized that this idea, this set of 10 experiences and the concept of a 0 to 10 ACE score, might convince resistant teachers to care about the struggles and emotional lives of kids. Maybe this quantifiable, quote, data will compel teachers to respond to the students with more humanity and kindness. They continue. At the time of this writing, it's been 25 years since the findings from the first ACE study. Since that time, the ACE questionnaire has been applied as a focus for research with studies published in over 500 journals across health fields, psychology, education, and criminal justice, and linked to a range of negative outcomes to people of all ages. From its inception, the ACE study and corresponding framework has faced criticism in the scholarly literature. These critiques take issue with the conceptual framing, methodological soundness, and misuse in non-research settings. Scholars have argued that the items provide limited information related to the circumstances in which ACEs occur. So it's because ACE research is based upon types of exposure, not the impact of the exposures themselves. Limited contextual information about multitude, frequency, and duration, as well as the age of onset and presence of other risk and protective factors contribute to a highly individualized real trauma. Within the conceptual critique, scholars have also advanced arguments that ACEs overemphasize interfamily dynamics and the home setting. ACEs center household functionality or dysfunctionality as primary and most significant forms of adversity, despite the fact that trauma can and does occur in a range of community settings, schools, hospitals, churches. McEwen and Gregerson highlight how factors such as violent policing, environmental conditions, and weakened network supports and experiences concentrated in low-income communities, food insecurity, housing insecurity, higher concentrations of juvenile injustice symptoms, are not accounted for within the ACEs questionnaire. To this day, that remains a debate about what can and cannot be considered an ACE. ACEs is a chaotic concept that lacks conceptual justification. The next category is the research methodologies. From study samples, measurements, analysis, and interpretation, the study sample has been widely criticized as it is collected from majority upper-class, middle-aged white sample, 80% white. Lacey and Minnis argue that the way ACEs measure diversity is problematic. They assert that creating a sum score of the trauma assumes the diversity is equal across outcomes, i.e., sexual abuse is weighed the same as parental divorce. The final scholarly critique we explore relates to the misuse of non-research settings. While the ACE checklist may seem to provide an efficient measure of trauma, the questionnaire was not designed for individual screening. Perhaps one of the more groundbreaking critiques come from the architect and his team. The ACE score is not a standardized metric of childhood exposure to the biology of stress. They're also concerned that ACE scores are being misappropriated as a screening or diagnostic tool to infer individual clients' risk and misapplied in treatment algorithms that inadvertently assign population-based risk for health outcomes for epidemiological studies to individuals. In all, there are highly relevant critiques related to conceptualization methods and misuses educators must be aware of. These critiques, too, allow us to see the ways in which ACEs questionnaire is incompatible with equity-centered and humanizing work. We believe the current conceptualizations of ACEs are incompatible with the tenets of transformational social-emotional learning. Asking about incarceration of a household member while failing to acknowledge the unequal and oppressive context of the U.S. policing and criminal injustice systems contributes to a harmful stereotypes and situates blame within communities affected by state-sanctioned violence. Similarly, scholars have found that the categories of neglect can be used to criminalize families of color for the expected conditions of poverty. The presence of items that ask about parental separation and divorce, too, normalizes and assumes the heteronormative nuclear family is the presumed ideal for raising a child. These questions and the underlying assumptions exclude single-parent, queer, multi-generational households, to name a few. ACEs strip humans of their agency and plurality by distilling trauma into types. When we acknowledge that trauma is highly subjective and deeply personal, we can see that ACEs framework does not provide opportunities for individuals or communities to define trauma for themselves. Despite good intentions to address trauma, there can be unintended consequences such as feelings of rejection. Vinet argues that when focused on grouping people into traumatized and not traumatized, it sends the message that trauma makes you different, which can cause division. As reported in local news stories, one Chicago elementary school assigned all students ACE scores and segregated children with 4 or more ACEs into a, quote, trauma classroom, teaching a different curriculum and thus denying children access to ambitious academic content. While this example illustrates the most extreme cases, we have seen in our work that harsh reality that schools across the country are assigning ACE scores to children. Schools have not been safe spaces for children, especially children of color. And bringing ACEs into already trauma-inducing educational settings may only exacerbate existing problems. End quote. So I have a lot of notes written about this excerpt. One of the things I have written down is that while Besser van der Kolk says that in that supercut, the political traumas are easy to recognize, but the individual traumas are not. When it comes to black folks, it seems like it might be the exact opposite. When it comes to families and family issues, the system can accommodate those because white people have those too. But when it comes to our larger systemic trauma, our communal trauma, our political traumas, those are invisibilized in ways that can lead to potential victim blaming. Moreover, I think it's important for folks to see that with the ACE framework, those 10 questions all get the same weight. So just from a pure objective standpoint, and again, trigger warning, sexual, assault warning. If you are molested by a family member, that's different than your family getting a divorce, right? Like, that can be so traumatic that just from a pure objective standpoint, we shouldn't flatten all those things together. But that's what the ACE score does. It necessitates a individualized, universalist conception of trauma, because that's the only way you get your objective score. And it's interesting that just as we had with neuroscience, this very seductive visual, this very seductive, in this case, number, now stands in for the neural scan, the brain scan from the last episode, as something we can hold up to say, look, it's objective, care about my trauma. But in the process of producing that artifact, we not just flatten the complexity, we might even be so decontextualized in what we experience that the artifact is no longer a useful representation of what it's supposed to encapsulate anymore. Finally, focusing on teaching, as someone who's coached debate, done debate camps all over the country, it's not the same as being a classroom teacher. I'll be the first to admit that. But we have to understand the racial dynamics of teaching, with white teachers teaching black and brown kids in public schools. What I believe we are seeing, based upon this quote and other studies, is a projection from white teachers onto black and brown students, where if they are loud, if they are disruptive, if they are not attentive, it's very useful for a white teaching establishment, a white power infrastructure, political infrastructure, to say that's trauma, as opposed to I'm a bad teacher, as opposed to my curriculum is not engaging to the students, so my curriculum is actually teaching lies that my students are backlashing against. Well, for our debate camp, we actually got some grants when we did our overnight summer debate camp in Baltimore. We had kids come from all over the country, and one thing I realized is that the assessments had no idea really how to evaluate what we were doing, because they were so baked into a language of assumptive pathology that they were assuming the kids weren't reading, and they wanted us to measure how much more they were reading. And it's like, well, no, they're debaters, so they're already doing a bunch of stuff. They're already kind of smart. So it's not like we're taking non-readers and making them read, and we can just show you some magical metric of improvement. And for us, the metric might be them reading less. It might be them looking at more YouTube videos of independent scholars rather than just reading what their teachers give them. But more saliently, one thing I realized is that the best metric of success for us probably would not be them getting along with their teachers better when they went back to wherever they were from after the debate camp. It would be them probably arguing more with their teachers wherever they were from, because they would get that skill from debate camp. But within most traditional Eurocentric nonprofit evaluations, a teacher evaluation and them having a positive conception of the student would be deemed as what is desirable. But for us, we wanted to teach them critical thinking skills, and to, if and when their curriculum was full of whitewashed, inaccurate material, have the strength and the research skills to be willing to push back against that. And I think that's a useful conceptual framework to apply to especially how ACE scores may be interpreted in places like schools. Because, to quote Florida State University professor of psychology Naeem Akbar, black people surviving in this country is a miracle. And frankly, We understand some of the tools that we've used to survive, but the dominant culture does not. So because of the violence the dominant culture knows has happened, what they can accommodate and what they see is our trauma. And they're projecting that onto our students with these ACE scores, and therefore, as the quote said, obscuring, and I would argue potentially obliterating, indigenous cultural survival tools and tools of thriving and processing trauma get obscured when the presence of particularly traumatic things from a Eurocentric perspective, particularly Eurocentric family trauma, begins to crowd out political trauma and also begins to crowd out political resistance as a way for us to process and get beyond that trauma. And I think a particular quote from Bessel van der Kolk's book begins to show once again what the implications are for us in terms of understanding how these traumas function within a Eurocentric imagination. And what happens when peoples of color's diverse experiences of political trauma get projected into programs of trauma-informed care and solutions to trauma, particularly childhood trauma, from a Eurocentric perspective, and what violence that does to indigenous political understandings of that trauma. So there's a particular part of Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps Score, that I wanted to read for you, but in the name of time, I'm going to summarize it. Bessel van der Kolk is at a retreat at the Esalen Institute, which is a very well-known retreat center, wellness space, psychedelic center that gained notoriety in the 60s. And he's doing this retreat, and a woman he calls Maria, who he identifies as Filipina. He says that she appears to not be fully engaged, and he engages her. She tells him that she's numb, and they begin to talk about childhood trauma, the content warning for intimate partner violence. He starts talking about Maria's experience of domestic violence within her family. Apparently her father was abusive against her mother. And he says, I stand here as a witness to your suffering, which she begins to feel affirmed by. Then he says, pick out your real father. And basically she picks someone within the group, and she basically tells them off a little bit. Then she is told by Bessel van der Kolk to pick out your real mother. And she picks a woman and says, why don't you stand up for me? You allowed him to be abusive. You should have taken me away. Then he is told Maria to position these folks in the room, and she positions them on the right side, which he links to a particular part of the brain that is on the right side of the brain, which he says is a visual cue. And he says, pick out your idealized parent, and she picks out her idealized mother and father. One of them is white, and they say, I stand witness to your suffering. And basically, the author says this is a big cathartic experience for Maria. Again, a lot of notes on this passage. I'll start off with the pedantic, kind of petty, but I still want to point it out thing. If this neuroscience stuff is so objective, many amateur neuroscientists in the audience may have some idea where I'm going with this. If it is on the right side of the brain, given what we know about the bilateralization of the brain and how the brain flips images, shouldn't she have positioned them on the left side of the room? If what he's saying is true about this particular part of the brain on the right side being the dominant way she is processing those folks at that time. So this is the thing. It's like this stuff feels subjective, but it's really specious. Because I don't know the right answer to this. I can't say for sure Bessel van der Kolk knows. But it sounds so cool. Look how she positioned them in the room. It's just like the part of the brain that's lighting up when she's processing her trauma. We can get so seduced by this stuff. So that's why I think it's important to call this stuff out. Second, brief explanation of the Esalen Institute. Many folks out there, like I said, will know this is associated with the hippie movement. And particularly with a particular branch of psychology that's much about personal affirmation, much about personal expression tied to the hippies. They actually had, during the 60s and 70s, encounter sessions at Esalen between the Black Panthers and members of the white community. And apparently they went absolutely terribly, according to the documentary The Century of Self. So this is an example of this feel-good California ideology not really having the tools to really accommodate racial trauma and the complexity of racial politics all the way back in the 60s and 70s. And now, 50 years later, Esalen is at the heart of the Silicon Valley tech meditation wellness culture. And this is the place where Bessel van der Kolk is doing the session, which I think is important, because as much as he sells this idea and we're trying to use this idea in deep political struggle, it is an idea that has to serve the market. And the market really is about individual wellness, self-affirmation, and it has to feel good for people to buy it. So even Maria finds this encounter session incredibly cathartic in a deeply explosive emotional release kind of way. But in terms of the long-term processing of complex trauma, think about the story I just told you. Was it really that good? Some folks will have concern about the way in which she processes her trauma being framed as they should have just left, because that can be picked up by those who support child protective services, particularly those who talk about abolitionist or non-carceral alternatives to CPS or non-carceral interventions into domestic violence. Her just saying, you should have taken me away, is potentially opening up space for the sort of police interventions that really risk re-traumatizing people. Moreover, think about this from the perspective of the California culture that she's in. This is the heart of the tech bubble. And we're talking about tech companies that literally exploit Filipino labor to do the filtering of Facebook posts to prevent traumatic material from appearing on Facebook feeds. So again, content warning for violence. People post stuff on social media that is not appropriate all the time. I won't list it all, but think about the worst things you can think of. That gets posted. As good as the AI is, many stories have talked about, in reality, they have to rely on labor from developing countries, particularly English-speaking, colonized by the English or Americans, developing countries, to actually screen the traumatic content off of these social media feeds. And that's exactly what Facebook has done empirically with the country of the Philippines. So even the ability for this encounter to take place in tech money-soaked Esalen with a Filipino woman, and there's no discussion of Filipino imperialism, there's no discussion of that within the context of understanding cultures of violence and why they fester, no conversation about Filipino politics, but it is framed as the individual people who are the failure, particularly Maria's mother, who is basically chewed out by Maria in this encounter. And you could understand in many different cultural systems that are more matrilineal or matro-focused, that would not be an acceptable response because of the role that women play holding the family unit together for the child to just pick up imaginary versions of her mother, completely separated from communal obligation, cultural obligation, especially when some of them are white. Her idealized parents are white. And Bessel van der Kolk says nothing about the dangers of having a trauma-informed methodology for Black and brown people, where one of his practices is picking up idealized parents for these Black and brown people who are white, and juxtaposing the white idealized parent against Maria's real mother, who she chews out for not being strong enough to leave, or potentially not being strong enough to call the cops on her father. In other parts of the book, Bessel van der Kolk talks about the long-term impacts of this childhood trauma. He talks about recent studies on epigenetics that talk about how levels of toxic stress experienced in childhood can change one's, not the genetic code, but which parts of one's innate genetic code are expressed or dominant at any given time. And so that's epigenetics, how your experiences can impact how your DNA begins to express itself within your body. Now let's look at all the pieces we have on the table here. We have DNA. We have genetics. We have discussions about how we as a society can advance and improve ourselves. We have conversations about trauma creating a drag on the economy, producing legacies of pain that can be passed down from generation to generation. We have discussions about how to have the most fit society that is resilient, that can no longer be subjected to the disease burden of trauma. Remember, this is all funded by insurance companies. So with all those pieces on the table, it's important to remember that we as a society have had conversations like this before. And those conversations didn't go very well because they were framed around the concept of eugenics, producing evolutionarily fit individuals who could reproduce society. Now, it's long been my fear that these discussions around trauma-informed care, because they will lead so heavily to imply that Black people are traumatized, that we either pass down the trauma genetically or through social experience to people in our community, that leads to a scarlet letter, a clustering of trauma in the Black community that will be blamed on the Black community itself and not the conditions that brought that trauma to the Black community, creating a sort of trauma-informed eugenics, basically. And it is in a book I found by Oksana Yakushko called Scientific Pollyannism, From Inquisition to Positive Psychology, where she talks about, apparently it's a pretty long historical legacy, of specifically talking about the demeanor of seemingly undesirable people, in her analysis, women, but also Black people, and that being part of eugenics, because we think it is skin tone, we think it is Hitler, we think it is so many things that would say this can never happen today. But the tying of what a good society is to one's outlook. Pollyanna is, of course, the reflexively positive character who, no matter what tragedy befalls her, seems to always produce a positive response. This is historical tying of scientific analysis and eugenics to mood, to outlook, to optimism. And the lack of optimism amongst oppressed people, be they women or Black people, was seen by eugenicists as part of how we should understand distinctions in society that can then be operationalized about how we contain their deviance, how we contain their, for lack of a better word, bad vibes. Now, I wanted to save time, but given how this content might be surprising, this may seem like a stretch to a lot of y'all out there, but I want to actually read a quote from Yakushko that really explains this link, not just historically, but contemporaneously. And she says, quote, "Rhetorical methods for denying the reality of emotional states by reducing them to reactions, reflexes, and so on were central concerns to eugenic and Darwinist-fueled scientists. Negative emotions were claimed to have evolutionary dysgenic impacts on human life. Watson," note, that's Watson of Watson and Crick, like the founder of DNA Watson, "further continued to rely on the racial and evolutionary views of emotions common to eugenicists. In a revised behavioralism, a chapter discussed optimal and non-optimal emotional states related to individuals' races." And this is a quote from Watson. "The Negro down south whines and trembles at the darkness which comes with a total eclipse of the sun, often falling to his knees and crying out, begging the deity to forgive him for his sins. These same Negroes will not pass through the graveyard at night. They cringe and shrink when charms and relics are shown. They will not burn wood which has been struck by lightning. In rural communities, adults and children collect around their homes as soon as dusk begins to fall. They often rationalize it by saying they will get the, quote, misery from the night air. Situations in the most ordinary kinds, judged from more sophisticated standpoints, arouse the strongest kinds of emotional reactions in them. Building on eugenic attitudes, Watson further links negative emotional states such as anger and temper, such supposedly problematic social and cultural evils as murders, sexual fetishes, homosexuality, chemical dependency, and sexual addiction. The behavioralist, first and foremost, quote, "has to study emotional behavioral genetically, and has to recognize many of these emotions are conditioned early and in their particular expression by parents, and therefore could be shaped by behavioral strategies towards optimal evolutionary fitness." She continues, Eugenics values are clearly in evidence throughout the parenting manual. As example, when Watson refers to Malthusian overpopulation problem and parrots the eugenics slogan, "No more babies, but better brought up babies." Watson further allies himself with eugenicists, as well as the middle and upper class American families, with openly eugenic proclamations such as, "There are too many people in the world right now, too many people with crippled personalities, tied up with such loads of infantile carryovers due to faulty bringing up. They will have no chance for happy lives." She concludes, eugenic organizations in the U.S. have rebranded themselves. Lynn continues to publish tremendous amounts of racist, quote, race realism research, such as lengthy articles, empirical proofs of Black and African American people are distinguished from other races by their psychopathic personalities. Pinker proclaimed that while everything else has supposedly failed, it is Western science and scientists who have brought on the evolution of everything good in society, singly responsible for humans' current progress, marking greatest health, happiness, and prosperity. Pinker's hereditary and biologizing views are masked by numerous proclamations that he's not a far-right ideologue, including inspirational quotes from the Beatles, Bill Gates, and Barack Obama. In this and other books, such as his Blank Slate, Pinker routinely represents himself as a progressive liberal gender feminist. Under this guise, Pinker openly promotes many racist and sexist scholars of the past. Resistance to racist and sexist supposedly scientific works is described by Pinker as an example of, quote, anti-scientific efforts to justify feel-good, quote, social justice dogmas that fly in the face of social truths. The, quote, leftist politics, which Pinker disparagingly alludes in his books, are political, cultural, and scientific efforts to acknowledge these foundational influences of injustice, racism, and oppression in shaping human society and the lives of individuals. It is these intellectual, scholarly commitments that Pinker attacks while he reestablishes human hierarchy that privileges white people, the wealthy, males, and other groups whose access to power has made them to the healthiest, happiest survivors in the evolutionary race. End quote. If you don't know who Steven Pinker is, he is one of the most prominent scholars in the academy. His work is actually cited very often in the context of violence, in the context of him arguing that it's the West and Western civilization that has decreased violence, though this work has been roundly criticized for ignoring the violence of colonialism, the violence of civil war, the violence of poverty, and only focusing on interstate violence, which kind of declined after World War II, but it's now back in a big way with Ukraine and the situation in Palestine. But his work is cited by, of all people, the people that do community-based violence prevention. You know, the people that we talk about getting money to all the time that do gang interventions on the street. Those people, in their reports, the academics, are citing Steven Pinker and his work on violence as authoritative in terms of his views that when the rule of law is devalued, that means that people will inevitably commit violence. So when we say that eugenicists and eugenic ideas have a legacy in the world, it's not hypothetical. It is literally the people who are doing the programming that's in your communities right now are citing scholars that not only come out of a potentially eugenic tradition, come out of a specific behavioralist eugenic tradition. From people like Watson talking about superstitious Negroes in the house before dark. Why do you think they were in the house before dark, Watson? It's 1935. The KKK was out. And they turned an evolutionarily advantageous cultural tradition of avoiding lynch mobs into a spiritual explanation that he then attacks them for as superstitious. So he completely ignores the structural violence of like literal lynch mobs and the complete impunity of black people against the structural, state, and individual violence of black people in the South, and he critiques their superstitious personalities and says that they are evolutionarily dysgenic and need to be avoided. These are the people that are being cited by the people designing the programming happening in your communities right now. So that's why people say, oh, can't we just kind of finesse it? Can't, trauma informed, we know it's not great, but can't we just work with it? Can't we freak it? Can't we funk it? You gotta be real careful what you finesse. Because at this point, I don't know how else to say it, we're finessing ourselves into trauma-informed eugenics. And that's a pretty high cost to pay. And it's a very questionable lateral move at best from what we've been getting in the past. So, to conclude, I think one last quote from Bessel van der Kolk illustrates what I think happens when you lack the structural, political, cultural understanding of how to think about trauma. And I'll just read from the author himself, and then we'll take the analysis from there. He writes, quote, and once again, content warning for violence and mugging. I was once mugged late at night in a park close to my home, and floating above the scene, saw myself lying in the snow with a small hid wound, surrounded by 3 knife-wielding teenagers. I disassociated the pain of their stab wounds on my hand, and did not feel the slightest fear as I calmly negotiated for the return of my emptied wallet. I did not develop PTSD, partly, I think, because I was intensely curious about having an experience I'd studied so closely with others, and partly because I had the illusion that I would be able to make a drawing of my muggers to show the police. Of course, they were never caught, but my fantasy of revenge must have given me a satisfying sense of agency. He continues. Back in 1893, Pierre Genet, the first great explorer of trauma, wrote about the pleasure of completed action. When people are forced to submit to overwhelming power, it is true for most abused people, women trapped in domestic violence and incarcerated men and women, they often survive with resigned complacency. One of my favorite body-oriented ways to build effective fight-flight response is our local impact center's model mugging program, which women and increasingly men are taught to actively fight off a simulated attacker. The program started in Oakland, California in 1971 after a woman with a 5th-degree black belt in karate was raped. Her executive function, or frontal lobe, went offline, and she froze. The model mugging program teaches women to recondition the freeze response to many repetitions of being placed in the 0 hour, a military term for the precise moment of attack, and learning how to transform fear into positive fighting energy. A college student with such unrelenting child abuse took the course. When I first met her, she was collapsed, depressed, and overly compliant. 3 months later, she was walking home from the library after midnight when 3 men jumped out of the bushes, yelling, "Bitch, give us your money." She later told me she took the same karate stance and yelled back, "Okay, guys, I've been looking forward to this moment. Who wants to take me on first?" It ran away. If you're hunched over and too afraid to look around, you're easy prey to other people's sadism. But when you look around projecting the message, "Do not mess with me," you're not likely to be bothered. End quote. So, as someone who was robbed at gunpoint myself, there's an interesting juxtaposition to how I handled my mugging. I wasn't physically harmed, but I was held at gunpoint, taken to get some money from the ATM. I had no money in my account, so I actually had to catch an Uber with the dude, buy him some shoes so he could sell them. He caught the Uber back home with me, got out halfway, I kept going home. So that was a very different experience, because I actually talked to the dude. He had just got out of jail, and he was like, "I don't want to be doing this, but I gotta feed my family. So yeah, you gotta give me something I can sell. I can show you the receipt." I actually wrote about the incident in the response to Baltimore wanting to produce a spy plane that would surveil the entire city in the name of protecting people from violence. Our argument was it would be used to surveil political dissidents and be used to criminalize not just people accused of crimes under surveillance, but their whole families and entire social networks. So, as opposed to channeling my trauma into working with the police, I did not call the police. I channeled my trauma into activism to deal with the conditions that drove the dude to need to mug me in the first place. But now, thanks to the Bible of the trauma-informed care community, we can add trauma-informed snitching to the list of offenses tied to this problematic Eurocentric perspective. So the idea of revenge and tying it so closely to policing and retribution, I think it's the deepest instantiation of what it means when we allow individuals like Bessel van der Kolk to dictate to us how we should respond to trauma in our community. On top of that, this entire idea that people who are traumatized become passive, I mean, this dude is not from America, but he must have not seen the entirety of the black radical tradition. And particularly I'm thinking of prison resistance, prison radicalism, Attica, George Jackson, and the idea that people become compliant in the face of trauma. You're projecting a universalized conception based upon your Eurocentric experience onto the entirety of people. And I think this is exactly the sort of risk we see here, where the sort of prison activism of someone like a George Jackson and the folks at Attica then gets pathologized as a trauma response. And this is exactly the sort of things that we risk by not having culturally specific ways to interpret our trauma. I think his inclusion of discussion of martial arts is also very interesting, because what I've heard as someone who's taken some martial arts classes and studied martial arts is there's lots of critiques of people that do these type of classes that are like, learn how to protect yourself from a mugger. Because oftentimes you'll teach people just enough to make them think they could take out a mugger, but not enough they actually can. And you actually really end up getting somebody hurt doing that. So what most people tell you is you should just comply, which is what I did. Even though I'd taken martial arts classes, I'm not betting my life on that stuff, right? And so this idea that you can have this fantasy of projection of agency into the act of fighting off an attacker, part of the reason it's critiqued by more progressive perspectives in the martial arts community is because you end up looking at everyone in the world as a potential attacker. One could say this is a very Eurocentric way of thinking about the world. A way of thinking about the world that reflects people like Steven Pinker. That the world is full of threats, and turning yourself into a tool of violence and being on alert at all times is a way for you to be able to anticipate the inevitable threat coming to you. And the idea that this is a trauma-informed methodology, not only in the physical act of doing the martial arts, but also the psychological propensity to see everyone around you as a potential attacker. Many progressive martial arts people say it's the exact opposite of a trauma-informed perspective. It is one that is projecting chaos, violence, and trauma into the world, putting you in a state of constant dis-ease and preventing you from thinking about verbal de-escalation and other forms of conflict prevention that are way more effective than waiting for someone to jump out, hoping you can beat somebody's ass to deal with your trauma. This is the Bible of the trauma-informed care space. And I want to say that, as a white guy, there are lots of black and brown people who have taken these ideas in places Bessel van der Kolk does not. But that this book is so central and inescapable to the entire space, I think is deeply, deeply problematic and very much demonstrative of when you have these ideas baked into this ground, it's seductive. They're actually harder to displace than traditional racist notions of super predators and innate cultural deviance in black communities, because they take just enough of our cultural DNA, just enough of our rhetoric, just enough of our hopes and dreams that people can invest in them and build their careers upon these spaces. And then as we interrogate them more deeply and they are revealed to be completely inadequate to actually accommodate what we need to happen, we have nowhere else to go. From NBC News, dated June 6, 2021. 5 months after Robert Jones, a 44-year-old aerospace process auditor, moved to what he described as a really nice neighborhood of Gulf Harbors in Pasco County, Florida, with his wife and 4 kids, 7 or 8 police cars showed up at his door. Officers said they had heard about their then 16-year-old son Bobby's school delinquency from colleagues in the Pinellas County, where his family previously lived, and wanted to make sure he understood that Pasco Sheriff's Office did things a little differently. Bobby had been expelled from his last school and was caught smoking pot and got in a fight. But both his dad and he hoped that the move to Pasco County could provide a fresh start. I thought it was a scared straight moment. Within seconds, they had their flashlights on and were, Jones said, running rampant without a search warrant. What Jones didn't realize at the time was that his son had been identified as a target by the Pasco Sheriff's intelligence-led policing unit. Police had gathered records on Bobby's previous interactions with law enforcement, using his history to predict what he would be a troublemaker in Pasco County. Anytime there was a crime in the neighborhood, such as burglary, Bobby was a suspect. On some occasions described in a lawsuit filed in March by Jones and others, targeted by the Pasco Sheriff's Office, as many as 18 officers would show up at their home, banging on windows. October 2015 through April 2016, Jones, who had no previous criminal history, was arrested 5 times. None of these arrests resulted in a conviction. His home was ransacked, laptop and phone seized. Pasco County approach intelligence-led policing, developed over a decade, has drawn particular concern from several of these experts because of the data sharing arrangement with the local school district. The partnership gave police access to data relating to schools' grades, attendance, and behavior, as well as any history of abuse or other, in quotes, adverse childhood experiences, close quote. School records were used to allocate students to one of 4 labels: on track, at risk, off track, or critical. Getting a D grade or having a parent or sibling go to prison could be enough to get a child on the at risk category, according to Pasco's own 83-page intelligence-led policing manual. The sheriff's officers took a list of 20,000 students determined to be at risk and cross-referenced it with their own records of law enforcement interactions to come up with a smaller list of a few hundred students to be monitored closely and offered, quote, positive mentorship and support by school resource officers, sheriff's officers, deputies contacted to work with the school. California's Riverside County stopped using a voluntary probation program. Adolescents who were signed up to the program faced unannounced home visits, restrictions on who they could speak to, and curfews. Young people were supposed to be allowed to do stupid things. That's how they learn. But with this program, if they made a mistake, they could be punished for the rest of their lives. I have friends who are police officers, and they've seen plenty of good police, but my kid has never seen them like that, said Robert Jones. His son Bobby, now 21, was currently in the Pinellas County Jail, awaiting trial for an assault charge, is struggling to deal with this fallout. I was still a kid, he said. Rather than targeting me, they should have offered some kind of redirection or supervision. That would have helped my mental state. End quote. The idea that a test sold to us as a tool of our liberation could be a tool of our young people's destruction. Giving the ACE test to the police to feed into their predictive policing algorithm. I wish I could say I was surprised. I went out looking for the story, unfortunately knowing I'd find it, and I found it. But it's because I've been able to do this work over the past 10, 15 years that it's become clear to me that the dividing line between the liberal, progressive, we need to improve black people, they're traumatized, let's help them, and the lock them up crowd is not nearly as thick of a line as most of us wish it were, as most of us believe it is, most of us need it to be in our minds to not be terrified walking around in the world. And as I kind of figured, this is going to be in some ways a 3-part episode, because the actual conversation about solutions, I don't want to rush it. I don't want to pigeonhole it into the back end of a conversation like this, but I do want to talk about where we started, where Bessel van der Kolk has been taking us all this time. He continuously says, trauma makes you feel stuck, and the antidote to trauma is movement. And if we take our example from the last episodes, that his series frees our body politic into series of change that demand recognition from the oppressors for our liberation, then the solution to traumatic political paralysis that trauma-informed politics locks us into is a movement of the body politic, not just a movement of our physical bodies. So I've been taking a few classes in capoeira, and I think this is a wonderful antidote to the trauma-informed politics of Bessel van der Kolk. Because when you're doing capoeira, I realized that after listening to the supercut in this episode, it does everything he recommends as a solution to trauma. The singing, the dancing, the coordinated rhythm, the coordinated movement. Capoeira is not about striking and violence and pain the way that the martial arts he actually advocates in this book are. It is a dance designed to tie people to a spiritual connection, to a homeland violently taking away from them with the Middle Passage. But it's not just that. Capoeira was banned by Brazilian authorities in part because it was a tool of resistance used at times in Afro-Brazilian communities against an oppressive state, not just an abstract tying to a past culture, but a tie into the making your body capable of the things necessary to liberate yourself. because the actual training of many martial arts was banned on plantations, this form of cultural sleight of hand was produced by Afro-Brazilians to make sure that the cultural ties and also just the physical strength necessary to fight was preserved. And again, this was banned because people were using these tactics, these tools, these rotas were extensions of communities of resistance or threats seen by the colonial Brazilian state. Even today, many of the martial arts from Brazil, the so-called luta libre, not lucha libre, but the Portuguese version of that, free fighting, luta libre styles, incorporate striking techniques from capoeira. And the funny thing about all of this is, I know for a fact, Bessel van der Kolk would not be against seeing capoeira as a form of trauma-informed therapy. But I doubt he would know enough to understand the distinctions between different forms of capoeira. Any of you who have studied it would know there's capoeira regional, which is the more exciting, acrobatic, exported version of capoeira that's been brought to us here at the States, that has decentered singing and decentered cultural analysis and spiritual analysis, often tied to more brown-skinned or light-skinned Brazilians, and it's capoeira Angola. They call themselves Angoleros because they were, of course, brought from Angola, and they tie themselves more directly to this lineage. And those are the sort of distinctions that we miss. Because regional has so much of the beauty, so much of the cathartic movement of Angola, that lacks the teaching methodologies, the focus on community, and the focus on political engagement. One of the things that we're learning in class is that capoeira is not capoeira, at least not in the Angola tradition, unless it's tied to empowering community. So the work it takes to get the capoeira Angola master paid to be able to go to Portugal, to be able to go to Brazil to study, those are not investments that are typically going to be made by foundations that don't value the spiritual cultural lineage that someone like that would bring to capoeira Angola work. And those are the sort of investments that, if we have community control of resources in our community, we can bring that sort of specific direct cultural lineage of our work into our use, into our communities. So not only do they do things like capoeira, they do the right form of capoeira. And if you know anything about what's going on right now in August 2024, capoeira is one of the biggest influences on breakdance, which of course is arguably got its massacre. It's got its formal death sentence by ray gun from Australia in the Olympics, but also links to hip-hop and versions of other cultural expressions that are critical tools in the toolbox for African people as we explore what it looks like to go beyond pedestaling our trauma and performing our trauma and to break out of it, pun intended. We hope you've enjoyed this second part, or this extension of our idea to take Bessel van der Kolk's text, The Body Keeps Score, and figure out what ideas are coming from it that we have to interrogate and which ones we have to attack. As I said before, I don't want to compress more conversation of solutions into an already long episode. I think what's going to happen is I'm going to do another episode which is going to talk more about the exploration of some of the solutions from an African-centered perspective, both politically and in terms of services and culturally. But that's going to include probably a lot of music and probably include a lot of hip-hop, because I think it's important for us to not keep these African-centered technologies in the past, but see how they're being brought into the future. That may have to not exist on YouTube. It may get demonetized on YouTube. And that's why we're relying on you to support this work. So please continue to go to lbsbaltimore.com. Please check out Black Liberation's Patreon and website and continue to support us as we go in search of Black Power. See you soon.